Well, time does fly, and we're now into Unit 3. Unit 3 is all about the prophets. It's one of the more exciting sections of the Bible. But what is a prophet? Well, there are different terms used in the Hebrew Bible. One is ro'eh and chozeh, which means the seer, they see something. They're known as Ish Elohim, man of God, or Ebed Yahweh, servant of Yahweh. But the main term is Nabi. Nabi means a spokesman, a mouthpiece. So God speaks, and the words of God comes through the prophet. Since this word is used more than 300 times in the Hebrew Bible, it's definitely the most important name or definition of a prophet. So a prophet is not so much a prediction or a predictor of the future. He is really a spokesman for God. There were two types of prophets, really. The first type are prophets who did not write anything. The second type are prophets who wrote. And those prophets who wrote books are divided into two groups. So you could say that there were three types of prophets. The writers that had a separate scroll each were known as the major prophets. And then there was a group that were lumped together in one big scroll, and they were called the minor prophets. The real first prophet in the Bible was actually Moses and Miriam. But when we speak of the period of prophets, we really talk of the period after the divided monarchy. So really starting from Elijah, that would be about the 9th century, all the way down to about the 5th century. So that period of 400-500 years is a concentrated period of prophets. Lots and lots of prophets came during that time, mostly writing prophets, though there were some who did not write books. So their world was basically the world of Israel. Now, what did the prophets do? Well, they did a number of things, preaching, making contacts with important people, performing symbolic actions. They were kind of actors in a way, and teaching. They were teachers. But what is more important are the contributions of the prophets. The prophets did three main jobs. One is reformation. Their job was to try and correct the wrong path of the people and bring them back to God. Second job was to redefine the law. So God had given the law to Moses. The people misunderstood the law, and they often took it one way, and then other times they took it another way, and so they came to define and make it clear. And then they were also known as watchmen. Their job was to test, to intercede, to warn of danger, future or present danger, political danger, military danger, but especially spiritual danger. In other words, they were God's messengers. They did His work. They kept the people close to God, or at least tried to, and they warned the people not to stray away from God, even when people did not want to listen to them. Basically, the prophets spoke God's words for Him. That was their mission, their work. The prophets who wrote books, their books were recorded in a scroll, kind of like this one. Now, usually it would be 3-4 of these scrolls that are joined together on the side to make a larger one, but they come in columns like this. So the first of these scrolls, when it comes to the prophet, is known as the scroll of Isaiah. Isaiah is the most important of the prophets. He had the biggest voice, the most important teachings. We know his calling by God. We know the names of the kings who were during his time, since his ministry lasted for 60 years. We know he was married. He had 2 sons, probably 3. And he made a lot of prophecies about the birth of Jesus or the ministry of Jesus. These are known as Messianic prophecies. He is the writer, or his scroll contains the most number of Messianic prophecies. So it's almost impossible to study the life of Jesus without consulting the Isaiah scroll, the most popular book among the Jews in the first century. Not so popular anymore among Christians today, which is a bit puzzling. The main contribution of Isaiah was to paint for us the most elevated, the most complex image of God. And in that view of God, he had this high view of God. We see God as the creator, God as the redeemer, God as the one who controls history, the three basic functions. We see God in all spaces. We see God controlling time from beginning to the end, from creation to new creation, the only prophet to do that. And so in Isaiah, we get this very high view of God. We get passages like, as far as the heavens are from the earth. That is the distance between God and us, his thoughts, his ways. And yet, this is a God who is called Emmanuel because he is with us. He comes close. He comes near to us. There are so many pictures of God in the book of Isaiah. Not only creator and redeemer, controller of history, he's also the king, he's also the warrior, he is the healer, he is the one who will put everything right together, he is the judge, he is everything that the people need him to be. But most importantly, he is the one who will finally create a new universe, a new world, a new heaven, new earth. And that is the scroll of Isaiah. Another major scroll is the Jeremiah scroll. It's not as long as Isaiah, but it's almost as long. Now, Jeremiah had a very unusual life. He was not permitted to marry by God. He was called from birth. He grew up as a priest, and eventually he had to live life all by himself. And he was told by God from the beginning that nobody would pay attention to his messages. He would not be listened to. In other words, he would be a failed prophet. How many of you would take up a job if you know you were going to fail at it? And you're failing because that is the will, that is the plan of God. And so Jeremiah complains a lot of autobiographical materials in Jeremiah. He even writes a second book called Lamentations, or Complaints, or Weeping, or Crying. So sometimes we call him the weeping prophet. He is the prophet, to use a swimming analogy, who had to swim against the tide. So the tides are blowing one way, he had to go the other way. A very difficult work. He lives up to the point and even beyond the point of the exile. So he saw that transition of history. He predicted it, and he even predicted when they will come back from Babylon to Jerusalem. He introduces the idea to us that God eventually will make a new covenant with Israel, and hopefully that will repair relationships. He is an important prophet, probably second in importance to Isaiah, and he spanned some very important events of history. He watched the downfall of the nation to Babylon, the nation of Judah. He watched the destruction of the temple and the city of Jerusalem, the people sent captives to Babylon, and he himself would die as an old man in Egypt. And so Jeremiah, while he may not have contributed as many prophecies about the birth and the ministry of Jesus, he is certainly very important in understanding that period of history and what happened to God's people, what happened to the covenant, and why God will make a new covenant. We need to look at Ezekiel and Daniel together because they lived at about the same time. They both did their work as prophets in Babylon, so they were part of the group we call the exile prophets. We will learn a little bit more about the three main groupings of prophets. We know quite a bit about Ezekiel's life. He was married and then his wife died in Babylon. We don't know if he was married before or in Babylon. He had a difficult work. He worked mostly among the captives, the people of Judah who were now in Babylon. He worked among them. And a lot of his work is not just preaching, but demonstrating his message in very strange ways. If you read his book, you will see he's the most eccentric of the prophets. Not because that was his style, but because God told him to do some very, very strange things, some action, some drama, in order to prove that God was speaking to them. The companion prophet, or the contemporaneous prophet, was Daniel. But Daniel worked in a totally different context. He worked in government. Daniel worked as a leader of the country with minimal or maybe no contact with the Jewish people who actually lived there. He was certainly a man of God because he prayed a lot. He never gave up on his faith, and he kept his faith clean and pure through all of his choices from the beginning of his time in Babylon until the end of his life. He saw the empires change from Babylonian Empire being replaced by the Persian Empire, and he worked in both of those. Daniel is also called an apocalyptic prophet because he has the most prophecies about the end of the world. Secondly, Daniel has the most time prophecies in the Bible. There are so many time periods. Whether these are symbols or they are real time periods is not always certain, but Daniel had a lot of time periods that he spoke about. So he was the time-based prophet. The two of them were in the same place, the city of Babylon, but different contexts. Ezekiel with the people of Judah, Daniel with the Babylonians. Ezekiel a shepherd to his people, Daniel a leader of the country. And their work was very different, but perhaps they complemented each other. And maybe this is why God had two prophets at the same time. One to look after his people, one to make his words known to the outside world of Babylon. For the next two lessons, I will do one video. And the reason is this. Both of these lessons deal with a group of prophets, all of them writing prophets, that we call minor prophets. We need to understand the term. This was somebody's invention much, much later. The reason they were called minor prophets is because all 12 books were written in one scroll. We're not sure why that happened. Zechariah is a long book. Hosea is quite a long book. Some of them are shorter, like Obadiah is the smallest book in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible. But they were all written in one scroll. And as a result, we call them the minor prophets, because the so-called major prophets had an individual scroll. There are 12 of these minor prophets, beginning from Hosea and ending with Malachi. The minor prophets worked through 3 time periods. Some of them worked before the Babylonian exile, some of them during the Babylonian exile, and then you have some of them who work after the Babylonian exile. So you have pre-exile, exile, and post-exile. Most of them were in the pre-exile period, only 3 in the post-exile period. We have quite a lot of information about these minor prophets, some very personal information, names of fathers, family belongingness, their original profession before God called them. So we know a little bit about their lives, we know a little bit about their work, we know a little bit about their period of time. When it comes to success of mission, it was very much a mixed bag. Haggai, who lived after the exile, was extremely successful, but most of the others were not. Jonah, who lived before the exile, was very successful, but did not like his own success, because he had a mission not to Israel or Judah or Babylon, but to Nineveh, an enemy nation, and he didn't like doing that job. The very last prophet is Malachi. He brings the Hebrew Bible to a close, because after Malachi, there are no more voices from God. There are no more messages from God. There are no more messengers. People kept writing books. So the writing of books did not stop. But the books that became Hebrew Bible stopped with Malachi. And for the next 400 years, there would be no prophet no messenger or message from God in the land. The people would be disconnected from God for 400 years. It's almost as if God is saying, I have spoken to you for centuries. If you go all the way back to Moses, that is 15th century BC, and Malachi is 5th century BC. So for 1,000 years, God had spoken to them through prophet after prophet after prophet after prophet. And then you have this concentrated period around the exile event. But by and large, the people did not pay attention. The people did not listen. And so it's as if God says, all right, you have enough scrolls, you have enough materials, you know all my instructions, you know all my wishes, you know all of my terms. Now it's up to you to figure out what to do with them. So for 400 years, we have what is called the long silence. There is no explanation in the Bible for this long silence. And even the explanation I just gave you is a little bit of suggestion, a conjecture, you might say. And there are many attempted conjectures by scholars, but we really don't know for sure. What we do know is that the prophet's work ended formally and would not begin again until John the Baptist. And so the prophets came in different forms. Some did not write books, many of them wrote books, some had their own scrolls, so they were called major prophets. Some were included in one scroll, so they were called the minor prophets. But when you boil all of it down, all the prophets did one thing, and that was to speak for God. Even if the message was unpopular, even if no one wanted to listen to the message, even if they tried to kill them for delivering that message, they were God's messengers. God might need you to be his messenger today. Think about it. Perhaps the most important messages brought by the prophets are what we call Messianic prophecies. These are messages about the future, the coming of Jesus, the so-called Messiah, the one who will deliver people from bondage of illness, bondage of poverty, but especially bondage from sin. He is the one who will reunite the God-human relationship that was broken in the Garden of Eden. Now, you already learned that Isaiah has the most messianic prophecies, but almost every prophet carried some messianic prophecy. So when we track all of those messianic prophecies, we know the time, we know the place, we know how long, how he will die, how he will be born. Every detail of Jesus' life was given in advance. The Messianic prophecies also paint different images of this Messiah. He will be a king, he will be a shepherd, he will be a warrior, he will be a servant, a number of different messages of the kind of work that he will do. And if you have access to the textbook, there is actually an entire table in your textbook dealing with the Messianic prophecies in the Bible. Some of them come from even outside of the prophets. The importance of these Messianic prophecies is how the New Testament dealt with them. The writers of the New Testament took these Messianic prophecies and directly applied to Jesus. That's how we know they are Messianic prophecies. In other words, the prophets didn't just bring messages for their time. More importantly, they brought messages for the coming of Jesus. And so they, more than any other writings in the Old Testament, they point to that very special time when the Messiah, when Jesus, when God would enter into our world in order to save us. Some of these Messianic prophecies are very interesting, and I hope that you will take time to read them and try to figure out all the details of what they're describing and what they're saying, and maybe get caught up in the spirit. Jesus, for us, is not a coming Messiah. He's the Messiah who has already come. For the prophets, he is in the future. And yet their future and our history are blended together in order to understand Jesus. So the Hebrew Bible kind of ends by looking forward towards the New Testament, towards the arrival of the Messiah of Jesus. The final lesson in this unit is about prophets and our world today. Well, first of all, everybody in our world today wants to know the future. This is almost like an insane desire. Everybody wants to know the future. This is why they go to fortune tellers, to palm readers, consulting the stars, and whatever else. And so there are many people in our world today, both in Christianity and other religions, who are self-proclaimed prophets. They say, we are prophets. We have the voice of God, and they have followers. There is a self-proclaimed prophet here in Thailand among the Hmong tribe. Okay, all these people bring so-called messages. They claim they had a dream, they had a vision sometime during the night, and God appeared to them, or a specter of some kind appeared to them. Sometimes, probably it was Satan who came as an angel of light and gave them messages, who knows. The Bible introduces an idea that there will always be false prophets. Wherever there are true prophets, there are false prophets, which means we should be careful, because some of these prophets that we see in our world today might actually be true. Otherwise, you won't have the false prophets. But there's always the danger of false prophets. Even Jesus warned that we should beware and be careful about the false prophets. So what should we do? Well, the Bible provides us some tests. Do you like tests? No, you don't, but tests are good. They help you to be certain. Well, there are certain tests the Bible provides about prophets. How do you know a prophet is true? Number one, their teachings should agree with the teachings of the Bible. They should not contradict the Bible. If they do, they are false. We live in the time of fake news. This is a good test. Prophecies. If they make a prophecy, that should come true. It should happen. It should be fulfilled. The Hmong prophet here in Thailand made a prophecy that Bangkok would be flooded and go completely underwater in 2011. Well, there was a flood in 2011, but it wasn't that big. The whole city did not really flood. So, false prophecy. It tells us that the predictions of the prophets can only come from God. If they come from God, then of course that would be true. If not, then they're not true. A third thing is, what is their attitude towards Jesus? Do they see themselves as equal to Jesus, or a replacement, a substitute for Jesus? If they do, then they are false prophets. And Jesus himself gives us one test. He says, by their fruit you shall know them. This year I had a lot of beautiful, good mangoes from my tree. And I know my tree is a good mango tree because the fruit are really good. It's the same. More importantly, you cannot find oranges in a mango tree. And so the quality of the fruit and the type of the fruit, if it matches the life, then that is coming from God. So if they are true prophets, they will be godly people. If they're not true prophets, they are charlatans. They are simply trying to get money, make a big business, prey on the uncertainty and the fear of people. So beware of false prophets, but open your eyes to the messages that God may still be sending us today.